Hey guys, tonight we are going to travel back to a time when the long arm of the law was, well, a lot longer and more inclusive than you might imagine. We're venturing into a world where the courtroom wasn't just for humans. Imagine a solemn judge, a serious jury, and a defendant accused of a capital crime. But when you look at the accused, you don't see a person, you see an animal. And I don't mean that metaphorically. If you were a pig in 15th century France, you could genuinely have a very, very bad day in court. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It truly helps the channel find other people who appreciate these strange little journeys into the past. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments what city you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always a quiet comfort to know where we're all settling in from around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air is cold, not just a gentle chill, but a deep, damp cold that seems to rise from the very flagstones beneath your feet. You pull your cloak a little tighter, the rough wool scratching your chin. You're standing in a small town square in medieval France. The year is 1457. The skies are flat, unforgiving grey, and the buildings around you huddle together, their timber frames leaning like tired old men. There's a strange energy in the air today, a mixture of grim duty and morbid curiosity. People aren't going about their usual business. Instead, they are all drifting in one direction, towards the town's main courthouse. You follow the hushed crowd, your boots squelching softly on the muddy ground. You pass a baker, his apron still dusted with flour, and a blacksmith, his powerful arms crossed over his chest. Their faces are stern, almost pious. You get the sense you're not heading to a spectacle for entertainment, but to a necessary, solemn ritual. The courthouse is a squat, imposing stone building, its heavy oak doors propped open. As you step inside, the noise of the street fades, replaced by the echo silence of a high sounding hall. The room smells of old wood, beeswax, and the damp will of dozens of assembled townspeople. Night struggles to get through the tall, narrow windows, so torches have been lit in iron sconces along the walls, casting long, dancing shadows that make everything feel more dramatic than it already is. At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform, sits the magistrate. H.E.S. a man with a severe face and a magnificent, if slightly frayed, fair-trimmed robe, flanking him are clerks, their quills poised over parchment, ready to document every word. To his left, a prosecutor shuffles his papers, his lips are thin, determined line. To his right, another man, the defense counsel, looks profoundly weary, as if H.E.S. already argued this case 1,000 times in his head and lost every time. It's a standard courtroom scene, one you might expect from any tale of medieval justice. But then, your eyes drift to the center of the room, to the defendant's dock, and that's when your brain takes a moment to catch up with what you're seeing. Because standing in the dock, secured by a loose rope tied to a wooden rail, is a pig. A large, pink sow, to be precise. She blinks slowly in the flickering light, her snout twitching occasionally as she sniffs the unfamiliar air. She seems utterly oblivious to the gravity of her situation, and this is the central, mind-boggling fact of the matter. This is a formal, legal trial. This isn't a mock-up or a village farce. This is the legitimate justice system of the Kingdom of France, in full session, preparing to try an animal for a capital crime. The pig has a lawyer, a real, human lawyer, appointed by the court to ensure a fair trial. It's a mainstream, accepted part of their legal process. You look closer and notice an even stranger detail, a perfect little piece of absurdity. The pig appears to be wearing a small waistcoat. It's a crudely tailored garment, but it's unmistakably a piece of human clothing, fitted to the animal's portly frame. This is one of those bizarre little details that history sometimes offers up. The accused animal was oft undressed in human clothes for its trial, and if found guilty, for its execution. The act of dressing it was a way to formally shift it from the category of beast to legal person, a temporary promotion just so it could be held fully accountable for its crime. But why go through all this trouble? The town could have simply dispatched the animal in the woods and been done with it. Historians still argue fiercely over the why of it all. Was this a genuine belief in animal culpability? A theological conviction that animals possessed souls and were therefore susceptible to demonic influence and moral failing, or was it a highly ritualized form of social therapy? A way for a community to process a traumatic event by finding any guilty party, and performing the ritual of justice to restore a sense of cosmic order. The debate continues in academic circles, with some arguing for the deep religious conviction and others seeing it as a function of a society desperate for control in a chaotic world. The magistrate clears his throat. The dry, rustling sound that cuts through the silence. The entire room goes still. The pig lets out a soft, low grunt. The prosecutor stands up, holding a scroll of parchment. His voice, when he speaks, is loud and clear, echoing off the cold stone walls. He is about to read the charges. You lean forward, along with everyone else in the room, holding your breath. What could a pig possibly have done to warrant this level of solemn legal ceremony? The prosecutor's voice fills the hall, and the charge he levels against the sow is simple, brutal, and utterly shocking. In the name of the Duke and the King, he proclaims, this sow is charged with the crime of murder, having, with malice and aforethought, willfully and viciously devoured the face and arm of the infant Jean Martin, leading to the child's demise. A collective gasp, a ripple of horror, passes through the crowd. It's one thing to see a pig in the dock, it's another to hear the devastating reason why it's there. As the prosecutor continues to lay out the grim details, your mind begins to paint the picture. To rewind the clock a few days and understand how such a tragedy could even occur, you leave the cold, formal setting of the courthouse and find yourself back in the messy, vibrant, and profoundly unsanitary reality of a medieval village street. Forget neat cottages with white picket fences. The world you're standing in is a jumble of wood, myrtle, and daub, with thatched roofs that are home to birds, mice, and legions of insects. There are no paved roads, just a wide, muddy track churned up by the hooves of oxen and the passage of wooden carts. And everywhere, there is refuse. People toss their household waste, vegetable peelings, bones from last night's stew, and things you'd rather not identify directly into the street. It's a stinking, chaotic environment. And who cleans it up? The pigs. This is the central, unglamorous fact of medieval urban life that you need to understand. Pigs were not quaint farm animals living in idyllic, fenced-in pens. They were semi-feral, free-roaming sanitation engineers. They were the original Roomba, wandering the village from dawn till dusk, gobbling up the filth and waste that would otherwise pile up and breed disease. They were a crucial part of the ecosystem, but this very freedom created a constant, low-level tension between humans and hogs. They would get underfoot, knock over market stalls, and occasionally, their omnivorous nature would turn from a benefit into a terrifying liability. You can picture the scene of the crime all too clearly. A small hovel, its door open to the street. A young mother, perhaps distracted for just a moment, turns her back to stir a pot over the fire. Her infant, Jean Martin, is sitting near the threshold, maybe playing with a wooden toy. He is small, helpless, and to the sow wandering past, he is indistinguishable from any other source of food left carelessly unattended. There is no malice in the modern sense, no evil intent, just the brutal, unthinking instinct of a hungry animal. The tragedy unfolds in a matter of seconds. A curious sniff, a sudden, horrific act, and a piercing shriek that is not the pig's. When the community rushes to the scene, they are confronted with a horror that defies easy explanation. A child is dead. A pig is standing nearby, its snout stained. In a world fraught with plague, famine, and inexplicable hardship, this is not just a random, tragic accident. It has to mean something. It has to be a transgression against the order of things, a violation of the laws of God and man. And so, the legal process kicks in. The pig is arrested. Witnesses are found. The wheels of justice, however strange they may seem to us, begin to turn. Here's a particularly bizarre little detail from the records of these trials. Guilt by association was a real thing. If other pigs were found at the scene of the crime, even if they hadn't participated in the attack, they could be arrested as accomplices. They would be held in the same jail as the main culprit, though they were often acquitted due to lack of evidence. In some documented cases, these accomplice pigs, upon being found not guilty, were still sentenced to watch the execution of their convicted comrade, presumably as a warning to the entire Porcini community. Historians are still debating the exact mindset behind this. Were they applying a human legal framework to an animal they believed was capable of criminal conspiracy, or was it a more pragmatic, if grim, decision? Some scholars argue that by arresting all potential culprits, the community ensured they had the right one, and the subsequent trial was a way to ritually cleanse the entire group, separating the one guilty animal from the others, who were then proven innocent and could be safely returned to their garbage disposal duties. The question remains, did they genuinely see a conspiracy? Or was this just a very thorough, ritualized form of problem solving? Back in the courtroom, the prosecutor has finished his damning account. The air hangs thick with the memory of the tragedy. Every person in the room, from the magistrate to the baker in the back, feels the weight of it. The crime has been established. The community's pain is palpable. Now, justice must be seen to be done. The magistrate turns his severe gaze away from the prosecutor and settles it upon the defendant's lawyer, the man with the profoundly weary expression, the man whose job it is to somehow formulate a legal defense for a pig accused of murder. You watch the weary defense lawyer rise to his feet, and a single, baffling question echoes in your mind: how is any of this even a real thing? How can a court, a system designed by humans for humans, have legal jurisdiction over a pig? It feels like a fever dream, a scene from a Monty Python sketch. But to the people in this room, it's not only possible, it's the proper and necessary way to handle the situation. The reason is that you are witnessing the intersection of two distinct, yet parallel, legal systems that governed medieval Europe. The first, and the one you are in right now, is the secular court. This is the law of the local lord, the duke, or the king. It deals with crimes that harm the community: theft, assault, and, in this case, murder. For the secular courts, the logic was surprisingly straightforward, if a bit circular. They believed that all creatures living under the dominion of the ruler were subject to his laws. If a man was subject to the law, and his horse and his pig lived on his land within the duke's territory, then by extension, the horse and the pig were also under the jurisdiction of the duke's laws. It was a kind of legal property-based logic. The animal was part of the community, and when it violated the peace of that community, it had to answer to the community's laws. This system primarily dealt with individual domestic animals: pigs, bulls, horses, dogs that had committed a specific, observable crime against a person or property. The trial was a public affirmation of the law's reach. It demonstrated to everyone that no transgression, no matter how strange its perpetrator, would go unpunished. It was about restoring order in the most visible way possible. But this is only half the story. There was a second, entirely separate legal system that operated alongside the secular courts: the ecclesiastical, or church, courts. And this is where things get even stranger. Imagine, for a moment, you are not a townsperson witnessing a pig trial, but a farmer standing in your field, watching in despair as a swarm of locusts descends upon your crops. You are powerless. This isn't one animal you can arrest, it's a slithering, crawling, flying plague. It feels like an act of God, or worse, a manifestation of the devil. Who do you turn to? You can't take 1,000,000 locusts to the local magistrate, so you go to the church. The ecclesiastical courts handled crimes that were seen as offenses against God and the natural order he created. And this is where they put entire species on trial. We have extensive records of church courts trying cases against rats, weevils, locusts, caterpillars, and even flies. These weren't trials of individual animals, but of the entire pestilent population. The legal process was astonishingly formal. The court would issue a summons, ordering the offending creatures to appear before the bishop or his representative to answer for their crimes of devastation. Of course, the rats and weevils rarely showed up, but the court anticipated this. A court official would be dispatched to the afflicted fields or granaries, where he would read the summons aloud in a booming voice, giving the pests a legal notice to appear. When they inevitably failed to do so, the court would proceed with the trial in absentia. This is where you see the deep theological reasoning at play, a mainstream belief, supported by theologians like Thomas Aquinas, was that while animals did not have immortal souls in the same way humans did, they were still God's creatures and part of a divine hierarchy. As such, they could be co-opted by demonic forces to do evil. A plague of locusts wasn't just bad luck, it was a potential sign of demonic infestation. The trial, therefore, was a spiritual battle fought with legal weapons. The ultimate punishment from a church court wasn't execution, but excommunication and anathema. The bishop would formally curse the pests, casting them out from the community of God's creatures and commanding them, by the power of the church, to leave the area and never return. This legal document, the malediction, would then be read aloud in the blighted fields. It was, in essence, a legally binding exorcism for a whole species. Here's the quirky little detail that reveals the blend of earnest faith and practical hedging. Sometimes, the church court would offer the pests a compromise. In one famous case involving weevils in a vineyard, the church, after pronouncing them guilty, allocated them a separate plot of land to live on, warning them that if they ever left their designated territory again, they would face the full force of an eternal curse. It was a bizarre, holy restraining order. Historians are still debating the relationship between these two legal systems. Did one inspire the other? It seems the secular trials of individual animals came first, rooted in older Germanic legal codes. The church courts appear to have adapted this practice for their own theological purposes later on. Some scholars argue the church saw the secular practice and refined it, giving it a more sophisticated theological framework. Others suggest both systems grew organically from a shared medieval worldview where the boundary between the natural and supernatural, the legal and the divine, was incredibly porous. Back in the French courthouse, the pig's trial falls squarely under secular law. It is here because it killed a human, a direct and bloody violation of the king's peace. But the religious undercurrent is undeniable. The crime is not just an unfortunate incident, it is a rupture in the moral fabric of the universe. The trial isn't just about punishing a pig, it's about making the world right again. In the eyes of both the Duke and of God, the defense lawyer, standing in this nexus of law, community, and faith, has an impossibly complex job ahead of him. The defense lawyer, a man named Jos, lets out a long, quiet sigh before he speaks. He is not a charlatan, he is a university-trained man of law, and his role is deadly serious. You might think his job is a joke, a mere formality before the inevitable guilty verdict, but that would be a profound misunderstanding of the medieval legal mind. The system, for all its perceived absurdity, cherished its own procedures. For justice to be true justice, it had to be seen as fair, and a fair trial required a vigorous defense, even for a pig. So what could Jos possibly say? He can't put the sow on the stand to testify in her own defense. He can't argue she had a difficult childhood. His task is to use the intricate, labyrinthine rules of the legal system itself to protect his client, and these lawyers were masters of it. You watch as he begins, his voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to the prosecutor's fiery condemnation. He doesn't dispute the central fact of the tragedy. He offers condolences to the grieving family, He acknowledges the community's pain. This is a crucial first step to show respect for the court and the people. Then, he pivots to the law. His first line of defense is often procedural. He might question the legality of the arrest. Your Honor, he might argue, was the warrant for this sow's arrest properly signed and sealed by the magistrate's clerk? Was it served during daylight hours as prescribed by law? Was the sow properly informed of the charges against her? This last point sounds ridiculous, but within the logic of the system, it was a valid question. If the animal was being treated as a legal person, then it was entitled to the same procedural rights as a human, including being formally notified of its alleged crimes. He could challenge the jurisdiction of the court. Perhaps the crime occurred on a piece of land that was technically under the authority of a neighboring baron, or even the church. If he could prove that, the entire case would have to be thrown out and moved elsewhere, buying precious time and perhaps finding a more lenient court. Next, he moves on to the witnesses. He would cross-examine them with meticulous care. You say you saw the pig near the child. He might ask a nervous-looking neighbor. But how near 10 feet 20 was it not true that half the village's pigs were in that very street, at that very hour? What distinguishes this sow? In your memory? From any other he would sow seeds of doubt. Not about the death of the child, but about the certainty of this specific pig's involvement. This is where you see the birth of a recognizable legal strategy. The animal's lawyer isn't there to prove it's a good pig. He is there to argue that the prosecution has not met the burden of proof required for a conviction. It's the medieval equivalent of if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Now for a truly fascinating and quirky tidbit about these defenses. One of the most brilliant and common arguments made by lawyers for animal defendants was the parity of esteem argument. The lawyer would stand before the court and argue that his client, the pig, was a creature of God. God, in his infinite wisdom, created the pig just as he created man. Who are we, a humble human court, to presume to pass judgment on a being of God's own creation? To punish the pig would be to question God's divine plan. It was a theologically dense, high-minded argument that essentially tried to elevate the animal's status so high that it was beyond the reach of human law. It rarely worked for pigs and other large mammals, but as we'll see later, it was a killer argument when defending swarms of insects in church court. Historians are still debating the sincerity of these lawyers. Were they true believers in the system, fighting for the legal rights of their animal clients with all their professional skill, or were they cynics, participating in a social ritual they knew was absurd, but going through the motions to earn a fee and uphold the system's integrity? The truth is likely somewhere in between. Many of these lawyers were devoutly religious and may have genuinely believed in the theological underpinnings of the trial. For them, ensuring the pig got a fair trial was part of their duty to God. Others may have been more pragmatic. They were officers of the court, and their job was to ensure the court followed its own rules. The identity of the defendant was secondary to the principle of correct legal procedure. A guilty verdict reached through an improper trial was an offense against the very concept of law. One thing is certain: they were paid for their services. Court records meticulously document the fees paid to defense lawyers in animal trials, paid either by the animal's owner or, if the animal was a stray, by the court itself. This wasn't a pro bono passion project, it was a recognized and compensated legal specialty. Back in the courtroom, Joss is now deep into his arguments. He's citing legal precedents from a case a decade earlier involving a bull. He's quoting scripture. He's questioning the timeline of events. He speaks for nearly an hour, his wary expression replaced by a look of intense professional focus. He is putting on a masterclass in legal maneuvering. He knows the odds are stacked against him. The community needs a conviction. The crime was too horrific to go unpunished. But he has to try. It is his job, his duty, and his entire professional honor depends on giving this pig the best defense the law allows. He is not trying to save a pig. He is trying to uphold the law. The fact that the defendant is a pig is a strange, but ultimately secondary, detail in his professional world. Despite the lawyer's eloquent and technically sound defense, The outcome is almost a foregone conclusion. The crime is too public. The victim too innocent. The community's need for closure too great. You watch as the magistrate, his face an unreadable mask of stone, confers quietly with his clerks. The rustling of parchment is the only sound in the tense, silent hall. Finally, he looks up, his gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd before landing, with grim finality, on the defendant in the dock. This court, he declares, his voice booming with authority, finds the defendant, the sow belonging to the farmer Perrine, guilty of the heinous and unnatural crime of murder. A murmur of approval, of solemn relief, ripples through the room. Justice has been served. Order is being restored. The magistrate then proceeds to the sentencing, and it is here that the fall, as our theatre of the law reaches its peak. The pig is not merely sentenced to be put down. It is sentenced as a human murderer would be. For this crime, the magistrate continues, the sow is sentenced to be taken from this courthouse to the public square, and there, to be first maimed in the head and forearms, in mirror of the injuries inflicted upon the deceased infant, and then to be hanged by the neck from the public gibbet until dead. The sentence is designed to be a direct, symbolic retribution. The concept of an eye for an eye is applied with chilling literalness. The maiming is not just a punishment, it's a public lesson. A grim reenactment meant to satisfy the community's sense of retributive justice. The hanging, usually reserved for the worst human criminals, elevates the pig's crime to the highest level of severity. It is the ultimate statement that this was not just an animal being an animal, this was a murderer being executed. The scene shifts. You are now back outside in the cold, grey air of the town square. A large crowd has gathered, much larger than the one in the courthouse. This is the main event. A wooden gallows, normally used for human criminals, stands starkly against the sky. The convicted sow, now without her little waistcoat, is dragged by guards towards the structure. She squeals in terror, finally seeming to understand that something is terribly wrong. The execution itself is a formal, public ritual. The town's official executioner, a man whose profession makes him both feared and essential, carries out the sentence with practiced efficiency. The maiming is carried out first, a brutal and unpleasant business that makes several onlookers turn away. Then, a rope is fastened around the pig's neck, and it is hoisted into the air. The crowd watches in silence as the animal struggles and then goes still. This public execution served multiple purposes. First and foremost, it was a catharsis for the community. It provided a definitive, visible end to a traumatic event. The agent of chaos had been identified, judged, and eliminated. The world, which had been thrown into disarray by the infant's death, was now set right again. Secondly, it was a powerful deterrent. And here's where the medieval mindset diverges so sharply from our own. We would think it's absurd to deter other pigs, but to them, it made a strange kind of sense. By making a public example of the criminal pig, they were sending a message not just to other pigs, but to the entire spiritual world. They were demonstrating to God, and perhaps to the devil, that their community would not tolerate such transgressions of the natural order. Here's a small, poignant detail from the historical records. The owner of the pig was often fined. He had to pay for the trial's costs, the lawyer's fees, the executioner's wages, and even for the cost of the rope used to hang his own animal. It was his responsibility for having failed to control his property, for having allowed a dangerous instrument, his pig, to cause harm. In some cases, the owner would make a formal declaration in court, renouncing ownership of the animal to avoid the hefty bill. Historians are still debating the nuances of this public spectacle. Was it purely about justice, or was it also a form of grim entertainment in a world with few distractions? A public execution was a major event. Some scholars argue that while the core purpose was judicial and religious, it's naive to think the populace didn't also derive a certain morbid thrill from the spectacle. It was a community gathering, a social event, albeit once entered on a state-sanctioned killing. Other historians push back, insisting that the solemnity and religious undertones of the proceedings suggest it was viewed far more as a grim duty than as entertainment. The truth, as is often the case, is probably a complex mixture of both. The event was likely experienced as a solemn ritual, a community necessity, and a deeply fascinating, if horrifying, spectacle all at once. As the pig's body hangs limply from the gallows, the crowd begins to disperse. They talk in a hushed tones. Their faces a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. They have faced a tear in the fabric of their world and have, with the full force of their law and their faith, sewn it back together. They go back to their homes, to their bakeries and forges, feeling that order has been restored. The law has been upheld. God is in his heaven. The Duke is in his castle, and a murderous pig has paid the ultimate price for its crime. For now, the world makes sense again. As you watch the townspeople retreat, their sense of restored order hanging in the air like smoke, you might still be grappling with the fundamental question: why did they believe an animal could be morally culpable in the first place to our modern, scientific minds? A pig acts on instinct, not malice. But to understand the medieval worldview, you have to peer deeper, past the laws and into the religious imagination that shaped every aspect of their lives. You have to understand that for them, the world was a battlefield, a stage for the cosmic struggle between God and the devil. At the heart of it all was the concept of a divinely ordained great chain of being. This was a hierarchical structure of all matter and life, an idea inherited from ancient Greek philosophers and thoroughly integrated into Christian theology. At the very top was God. Below him were the angels, then humanity, then animals, then plants, and finally, inanimate minerals and rocks. Everything had its place. A king was above a peasant. A lion, the king of beasts, was above a worm. An oak tree was above a weed. This order was seen as natural, perfect, and holy. A crime, any crime, was not just a violation of human law, it was an act against this divine order. But the death of an infant at the jaws of a pig was a particularly jarring transgression. It was an inversion of the natural hierarchy. An animal, a lower being, had destroyed a human, a higher being created in God's image. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a form of cosmic treason. It was an assault on the very structure of God's creation. The world was literally turned upside down, and the trial and execution were a ritual designed to turn it right side up again. But this still doesn't explain the pig's guilt. Why not just see the animal as a mindless instrument? This is where the devil comes in. Medieval theology was deeply concerned with the actions of demons and the influence of Satan in the earthly realm, while mainstream theologians like Thomas Aquinas were careful to state that animals did not possess rational souls and therefore could not sin in the same way humans could. They absolutely believed that animals could be used as vessels or instruments by demonic forces. A demon could enter a pig, possess it, and use its body to carry out an evil act. So when the court tried the pig, they weren't just trying a farm animal, in a very real sense. They were putting a potential demonic agent on trial. The crime wasn't just the pig's, it was Satan's, working through the pig. The legal process, with its solemn rituals and pronouncements, was a way of fighting back. It was a form of judicial exorcism. By dressing the pig in human clothes, assigning it a lawyer, and executing it with the full ceremony of human justice, the community was making a powerful statement. They were demonstrating that even when the devil worked through the lowliest of creatures, he could not escape the reach of Christian justice and the order of a Christian society. This brings us to a wonderfully strange and specific belief from that time, the idea of the demonic pact with an animal. While we're all familiar with the concept of a witch and her familiar like a black cat, that's a later, more specific development. The earlier, broader idea was that any animal could, in theory, be tempted or coerced by the devil. We have records of sermons where priests would warn their congregations to be wary of animals that behaved unnaturally, as this could be a sign of demonic influence. This is a point where historical interpretation gets tricky. Did the average peasant in the courtroom truly believe the pig was possessed by a literal demon from hell, or was it a more metaphorical understanding? Scholars are divided on this. Some argue that the belief in literal, active demonic intervention was pervasive and deeply felt by all levels of society. They point to the language used in the trial documents, which often speaks of the animal's actions as diabolical, vicious, and against nature. Others suggest it was more of a useful framework. The demonic influence narrative provided a satisfying explanation for an otherwise random and terrifying event. It gave the horror a name and a face, and, in doing so, made it something that could be confronted and defeated through the rituals of the court. The pig becomes a stand-in, a physical proxy for the abstract forces of evil and chaos that threatened their lives. So the next time you picture the pig in the dock, don't just see a farm animal in a silly waistcoat. See it as the medieval world saw it, as a symbol. It was a symbol of a world thrown out of balance, a potential vessel for cosmic evil, and a problem that could only be solved by reasserting human control and divine order through the powerful magic of the law. The trial wasn't just about what the pig did. It was about what the pig represented. In punishing the pig, they weren't just executing an animal, they were battling the forces of darkness on their own doorstep, using the only weapons they had: a judge, a lawyer, the hangman, and an unshakable belief in their place in God's ordered universe. Now, let's leave the secular courthouse with its blood and soil crimes and step into the even more surreal world of the ecclesiastical, or church, courts. If you thought a single pig on trial for murder was strange, get ready. We're about to witness the law take on entire armies. We're talking about putting plagues on trial. Imagine you're a farmer in 16th century Switzerland. You've worked your land tirelessly. You've prayed for good weather. You've tended your vines. And now, just as your crops are beginning to flourish, a new disaster strikes. It's not a single, identifiable animal. It's a creeping, crawling, slithering menace. A horde of weevils, or maybe field mice, or a swarm of locusts, is systematically devouring your livelihood. You can't catch them all. You can't build a fence high enough. It feels like a biblical curse, a punishment from on high. You and your fellow villagers don't go to the local magistrate. His authority ends with things you can clap in irons. This is a spiritual problem, so you go to the bishop. You launch a formal, legal complaint with the church court against the weevils. Then the church, in all its wisdom and procedural glory, takes your case. The first step, as we touched on before, is the summons. An ecclesiastical official, often a junior priest or a clerk, is dispatched to the afflicted fields. He is carrying a formal legal document, a writ from the bishop. He stands there, amid the ruined crops, and in a loud, solemn voice, he reads the summons. He calls the weevils, rats, or other vermin by name, informs them that a complaint has been lodged against them for their unlawful devastation of the good Christian folk's sustenance, and commands them to appear before the ecclesiastical court on a specific day to answer for their crimes. This was often done 3 times, on 3 separate days, to ensure the message was properly delivered. Of course, the weevils never showed up for their court date. The court wasn't naive, it anticipated their failure to appear. But the procedure was vital. By failing to answer the summons, the creatures were now officially in contempt of the church's authority, which was a crime in itself. The trial would then proceed. The villagers who brought the complaint would act as the prosecution, presenting evidence of the damage. They might bring in ruined ears of corn, gnawed vine stalks, or even jars filled with the offending insects as evidence. The court would hear their testimony, documenting the scale of the plague. And then comes the part that truly showcases the church's commitment to its own legal philosophy. The pests were assigned a defense lawyer. Just as the pig in the secular court had a lawyer, so too did the absent army of weevils. This lawyer, known as a proctor, was appointed by the court to represent the interests of the accused animals. His job was to argue on their behalf, to ensure that even a plague of locusts received a fair trial according to canon law. This seems utterly bizarre, but it was rooted in a deep theological principle. God created all creatures, even the humble weevil. They, too, had a right to exist and to eat. A plague was not the weevils being evil, it was the weevils being in the wrong place, violating the divine order that separated the human world from the animal world. The lawyer's job was to defend their God-given right to sustenance, while acknowledging that their current behavior was problematic. A fascinating cold case from the annals of church law is the trial of the flies of Geza, Germany, in the 13th century. A Cistercian monastery was so plagued by flies that they couldn't conduct their services in peace. They brought a formal case against the fly population. After the trial, the bishop excommunicated them, and according to the chronicle, the flies immediately dropped dead in heaps. While this sounds like a miracle, a more mundane explanation might be a sudden cold snap or some other natural event, which the monks readily interpreted as a sign of their legal victory's divine enforcement. So why did the church go to these lengths again? Historians debate the core motivation. Some argue it was a form of mass psychological counseling. In the face of an uncontrollable natural disaster like a pest infestation, people feel helpless and terrified. The legal process gave them a sense of agency. It provided a structured, ritualized way to confront the chaos. It turned a natural event into a moral drama with clear roles: victims the farmers, villains the pests, and a powerful hero the church who could fight on their behalf. It replaced panic with procedure. Other historians see a more pragmatic, almost cynical motive. By positioning itself as the sole authority capable of dealing with such supernatural threats, the church powerfully reinforced its importance in the daily lives of the common people. The local lord could protect you from bandits, but only the bishop could protect you from a plague of caterpillars. It was a demonstration of power, proving that the church's authority extended not just over the souls of men, but over the very beasts of the field and insects of the air. It was, in some ways, the ultimate marketing campaign for the power of the faith. Whether a sincere act of faith or a calculated power play, or most likely, a complex mix of both, the scene is extraordinary. Imagine it a solemn court. Learned men in robes debating fine points of canon law, all in service of bringing a lawsuit against a million tiny defendants who are, at that very moment, continuing to munch their way through the evidence. It's a testament to a time when law was not just a tool for social order, but a weapon in a cosmic war. In the long and strange history of animal trials, one name stands out among the defense lawyers, a man who became a legend in his own time for his brilliant, dogged, and utterly absurd defenses of the animal kingdom. His name was Bartholomew Chasny, a 16th century French jurist who was, by all accounts, one of the most respected legal minds of his day. He wrote influential treatises on law that were studied for centuries, and he also happened to be the go-to lawyer for vermin. Let's zoom in on his most famous case, which has become the defining example of the genre, the Great Rat Trial of Orton. Friends, around the year 1510, the situation was familiar. The province was suffering from a devastating infestation of rats. They were everywhere, devouring grain stores, ruining crops, and spreading filth. The desperate citizens, having exhausted all other options, did what any good 16th century French citizen would do: they took the rats to court. The ecclesiastical court of Orton initiated the proceedings, and when the rats, having been duly summoned, failed to appear, the court, following proper procedure, appointed a lawyer to represent the absent rodents. That lawyer was the young, ambitious Bartholomew Chasny. This was not a joke case assigned to a junior associate. Chasny took the appointment with the utmost seriousness. It was a high-profile opportunity for him to demonstrate his mastery of legal procedure and his genius for argumentation, and he did not disappoint. You have to imagine him, with sharp, well-dressed men, standing before a panel of equally serious clergymen, ready to defend a client he had never met and who was, at that very moment, probably chewing through the courthouse foundations. His first move was a masterpiece of procedural delay. When the court noted that his clients had failed to appear, Chasney stood up and argued that the summons had been improper. He contended that the summons was addressed to the rats of Orton generally, but this was too vague. His clients, he argued, were a diffuse population, spread across numerous villages and hamlets. Many of them lived in remote locations and might not have heard the summons. It was unfair to hold them in contempt when they had not been properly served. He argued that for the summons to be legally binding, it must be read from the pulpit of every single church in every single parish throughout the affected region. The court, bound by its own love of procedure, had to concede that this was a fair and logical point. The judges grumbled, but they agreed. They issued an order for the summons to be read aloud by priests all across the province, a process that took weeks, buying Chasney's furry clients a significant amount of time. This tactic reveals the core strategy of these lawyers to use the system's own rules against it. Chasney knew the court prided itself on its meticulous fairness. He exploited that pride by demanding that the rats receive the exact same procedural considerations as a human defendant. He wasn't arguing that the rats were innocent, he was arguing that the process of accusing them was flawed. This brings us to a wonderfully nerdy little tidbit of legal history. Chasney actually wrote about his theories on animal trials in his legal commentaries. He laid out the philosophical justification for his work. He argued that God, in the book of Genesis, gave humanity dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moves there upon the earth. For Chasney, this dominion was not a license for tyranny, but a form of feudal lordship. Humans were the lords of the animal kingdom, which meant they had a responsibility to govern them justly. Just as a human lord had to provide a fair court for his human vassals, he also had an obligation to provide a fair court for his animal subjects. To deny the rats a proper trial was for humanity to fail in its God-given duty as a just ruler. It was a brilliantly crafted argument that turned the pest control problem into a profound test of humanity's moral leadership. Historians looking at Chasney's career see him as a pivotal figure. Was he a true believer who felt he was fighting for the rights of God's lowliest creatures, or was he the ultimate legal technician? A brilliant gamesman who saw the rat trial as the perfect intellectual puzzle on which to sharpen his skills and build his reputation. The consensus among many legal historians is that he was primarily the latter. He saw the animal trials as a kind of legal laboratory, a place where he could test the absolute limits of procedural law without the messy complication of a human client's life being on the line. He could make radical, absurd-sounding arguments and force the court to take them seriously, all in the name of legal principle. The rats were just a convenient, furry vehicle for his own towering legal ambition. But regardless of his personal motives, the effect was the same. He stood in that court in Orton as the official, state-sanctioned voice for the voiceless. His performance was so compelling, so legally astute, that he forced the entire apparatus of the church's legal system to grind to a halt, all to accommodate the rights of a few million rats. And as we'll see, his first argument was just a warm-up. The great legal battle of Orton was just getting started. The priests have done their duty from every pulpit in the province of Orton. The formal summons has been read. The rats of the region have been publicly and legally notified of their court date. Weeks have passed. The day of the trial arrives once more, and the ecclesiastical court convenes. The prosecutors are ready. The judges are impatient. And, to absolutely no one's surprise, the defendant's dock is empty. The rats have, once again, failed to appear. The prosecutor stands up, a smug look on his face. He addresses the court, arguing that the defendants have now been properly summoned not once, but twice, and their continued absence is a clear act of defiance and contempt. He asks the court to proceed with a summary judgment. To find the rats guilty in absentia and move directly to the sentencing phase, which would be the formal course of excommunication. It seems like an open and shut case. But then, Bartholomew Chasney rises to his feet, a look of calm reason on his face. He is about to deliver the argument that would make him a legal legend. "Your Honours," he begins, his voice respectful but firm, "it is true my clients are not here. But it is not out of contempt for this esteemed court. It is because they cannot travel here in safety. A confused silence falls over the courtroom. Chasney continues, laying out his argument with the precision of a master logician. The journey from their homes in the villages and fields to this courthouse is a long and perilous one. He explains, my clients, who are of a nervous disposition and travel in large family groups, are well aware that their mortal enemies, the cats, lie in wait along every road and in every alleyway. He pauses for dramatic effect, letting the image sink in. The cats of this province, he declares, are notorious for their vigilance and their hostility towards my clients. They are, in essence, assassins waiting to ambush them. For this court to command my clients to appear, knowing that the path is fraught with mortal danger, is to sentence them to death before they have even been judged. He then makes this brilliant legal move. He argues that if the court truly wishes his clients to appear, it must first issue an injunction against all the cat owners in the province. The court must order them to lock up their cats, to post a bomb guaranteeing the cats will not harm the traveling rats, and to ensure safe passage for the defendants as they make their way to the trial, until such a time as the court can guarantee the safety of his clients from their well-known and avowed enemies. He argues, their absence is not only excusable but entirely necessary for their self-preservation. You have to appreciate the sheer, unadulterated genius of this. He is using the court's own legal framework, the concept of safe passage for defendants in a context so absurd it borders on performance art. He has turned the natural food chain into a legal impediment. The cats are no longer just cats, they are a hostile party creating a security risk that the court has a legal obligation to mitigate. The judges were, to put it mildly, flummoxed. Chasney's argument was logically sound. If the rats are legal defendants, then they are entitled to protection on their way to court. The argument was completely ridiculous in its substance, but it was technically perfect in its legal form. The court was trapped in the cage of its own logic. Here we have a perfect, quirky example of how these trials forced a collision between abstract legal theory and messy, biological reality. The law wanted to treat the rats as people, but it couldn't ignore the fact that they were also unconventional food for cats. Chasney brilliantly exploited this contradiction. He was effectively asking the legal system, do you truly believe in what you're doing? If so, you must follow your principles to their logical, albeit absurd, conclusion. The historical record of the Orton trial, mostly transmitted through Chasney's own writings and later chronicles, becomes a bit fuzzy on the final outcome. This is a point of debate for historians. Some accounts say the court, utterly exasperated and unable to find a flaw in his argument, simply let the case fizzle out, adjourning indefinitely while they considered the motion, effectively allowing the rats to win by default. Other interpretations suggest the case was ultimately lost by the rats, but only after Chasney had tied the court in procedural knots for months or even years. The most enduring version of the story is that his defense was so masterful, so unanswerable, that the case was quietly dropped. What we do know for certain is that the story of his defense of the rats of Alton became famous throughout Europe. It was cited as an example of brilliant legal reasoning. It solidified Chasney's reputation as a man who could win any argument. No matter how outlandish, it wasn't seen as a farce, but as a demonstration of supreme legal skill. This case perfectly illustrates the internal conflict of the animal trial system. It was a system that demanded a deep, serious belief in its own premises. But those premises were so strange that they could be easily manipulated by a clever lawyer to produce completely unworkable results. Chasney didn't blow up the system from the outside, he showed how it could deconstruct itself from within, using nothing more than its own rulebook. In defending the rats, he wasn't just saving them from a curse, he was exposing the fragile, paradoxical heart of the entire practice. The saga of Bartholomew Chasney and the rats of Alton might be the most famous insectoid-adjacent trial, but it was far from a one-off event. This legal war against the natural world was waged on multiple fronts. So let's shift our focus from the granaries of Alton to the sun-drenched vineyards of Street Julian. a village in the French Alps. A few decades earlier in 1487, here, the enemy wasn't a rodent, but a small, winged beetle known as a snout weevil. Would Sharon Kun. Imagine the scene. You are a wine grower in street. Julian. Your entire life, your family's prosperity, and the town's whole economy depend on the annual grape harvest. For generations, your family has cultivated these vines, but this year, a dark cloud has descended. A plague of weevils has infested the vineyards, gnawing at the leaves and threatening the entire harvest. It's a catastrophe. Following the established playbook, the villagers appeal to the local ecclesiastical court. A trial is convened. Summons are issued. A proctor is appointed to defend the weevils. The legal machinery clunks into motion once again. The villagers present their case, detailing the ruinous damage. The weevil's lawyer, in turn, does his job, likely deploying the classic creatures of God defense. He would have argued that the weevils were merely partaking of the sustenance God had provided for all living things. The court, after hearing both sides, arrives at a verdict that is a testament to the medieval desire for compromise and order. They found the weevils guilty of trespassing on causing damage. However, recognizing the defense's point that the weevils also had a right to exist, the court engineered a remarkably creative solution. They issued a formal decree, a legal judgment that was both a punishment and a resettlement plan. The court officially designated a separate piece of land, a nearby plot of uncultivated, less desirable territory, as a reservation for the weevils. The legal document described the location and boundaries of this weevil sanctuary in meticulous detail. The judgment then ordered the weevils to depart from the vineyards and relocate to their new, designated home, where they could live and eat in peace without disturbing the human inhabitants of street. Julian. To ensure the weevils complied, the decree contained a threat. It stated that if any weevil were found in the vineyards after a certain date, the entire weevil population would be subject to a formal anathema, a powerful curse and excommunication from the church. It was, in essence, a legally binding eviction notice combined with a threat of divine sanctions. But here's the part that makes this story even more extraordinary. The villagers of Street, Julian, in an act of what can only be described as pious legalism, refused the deal. They filed a formal appeal. Their reason the plot of land granted to the weevils was, in their opinion, barren and offered insufficient sustenance. They argued that forcing the weevils to move to a place where they would starve was an unjust sentence. They were essentially arguing for the humanitarian rights of the very pests that were destroying their livelihood. This little-known detail of the Street, Julian weevil trial is absolutely fascinating. It shows that the process wasn't just a blind, angry lashing out at nature. There was a genuine, deeply felt belief that justice had to be just, even for a beetle. The villagers weren't just trying to get rid of the weevils, they were trying to do so in a way that was righteous and pleasing to God. To trick or starve the weevils into submission would be an unjust act, and an unjust act might invite even worse divine punishment down the line. They needed to solve their weevil problem without committing a sin in the process. Historians are still puzzled by the precise motivations of the villagers. Was this a display of profound Christian charity and a sophisticated understanding of justice, or was it a form of superstitious hedging? Some scholars argue the latter. They suggest the villagers were afraid that if they accepted a cruel verdict, God might see them as uncharitable and punish them with an even worse plague next year. By advocating for the weevils' right to a fertile new home, they were demonstrating their own piety and righteousness, effectively telling God, "Look, we are being more than fair. We are good Christians. Please reward us with a bountiful, weevil-free harvest." It was a legal and spiritual negotiation with the divine. The court records show that this legal wrangling went on for months. There were hearings and counter-arguments about the quality of the soil in the weevil reservation. The case was eventually abandoned, likely because the seasons changed. The harvest was lost, and the weevil population naturally declined, rendering the whole legal process moot. The Street, Julian case is a perfect snapshot of the practice, at its most developed and most bizarre. It shows a community attempting to use the most sophisticated tool it had the law to manage a problem we would now solve with pesticides. They saw the natural world not as a system of biological imperatives, but as a society of moral agents, all living under God's law. And if a segment of that society got out of line, you didn't just exterminate it, you took it to court. You heard its defense, and you tried to reach a just and equitable settlement, lest you offend the ultimate judge who presided over all of you. As you watch these strange legal dramas unfold, a pig on trial for murder, a community negotiating land rights with beetles, you start to see a deeper pattern emerging. Beyond the intricate laws and the theological justifications, these trials served a powerful and profoundly human psychological need. In a world that was often violent, unpredictable, and terrifyingly random, the animal trial was a desperate and creative attempt to find a scapegoat. Let's step back from the legal specifics and think about the emotional landscape of medieval life. Your existence is fragile. You are at the mercy of forces far beyond your control. One year, the rains don't come, and your crops wither. The next, the rains don't stop, and they rot in the field. A plague can sweep through your village and wipe out a third of the population in a matter of weeks, with no explanation other than God's will. Your child can die from a fever. Your cow can fall ill. Your house can burn down. Chaos is a constant neighbor. In the face of such overwhelming uncertainty, the human mind craves to things an explanation and a solution. You need to know why this terrible thing happened, and you need to feel like you can do something to stop it from happening again. This is where the concept of the scapegoat becomes not just useful, but essential for a community's mental health. The term scapegoat itself has ancient, biblical roots. In the Old Testament, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would symbolically place all the sins of the Israelite community onto the head of a goat, which was then driven out into the wilderness to die, carrying the people's sins away with it. This ritual cleansed the community, restoring its relationship with God. The medieval animal trial was, in many ways, a more elaborate and judicialized version of this same ritual. Let's return to the case of a murderous pig. A child's death is a profound trauma. An accidental death is, in some ways, the worst kind of trauma because it's meaningless. There's no one to blame, no villain to hate, just a void of grief and random chance. But if you can transform that pig from a simple animal acting on instinct into a murderer, a moral agent who has willfully committed an evil act, then the tragedy is no longer meaningless. It has a cause. It has a culprit. The trial is the process of formally identifying and labeling that culprit. It takes the free-floating anxiety and grief of the community and focuses it onto a single, tangible target. The pig in the dock becomes the physical embodiment of the terrible thing that has happened. All the sheer anger and sorrow can be directed at it. It is no longer just a pig, it is the living symbol of their suffering. Then comes the execution. This is the crucial final act, the equivalent of sending the goat into the wilderness. By publicly and ritually destroying the guilty party, the community symbolically destroys the crime itself. They are not just killing a pig, they are purging the evil, cleansing the trauma, and restoring the broken order. The execution is a public performance that says, the problem has been solved, the evil has been punished, we are safe again. It's a form of collective emotional catharsis. The scapegoating mechanism is even clearer in the case of the insect plagues. A swarm of locusts is an impersonal, unstoppable force of nature. You can't fight it. You can reason with it. It induces a profound sense of helplessness. But if you put the locusts on trial, you magically transform them from a natural disaster into a legal opponent. They are no longer a blind force, they are a guilty party. The trial gives the community a script to follow, a way to act, a way to feel in control, even when they are not. The final curse of excommunication, even if it doesn't actually kill a single locust, provides a sense of closure. The community has done something. They have fought back with the weapons of their faith and their law. ache-worky but telling detail is how often these trials were linked to periods of unusual hardship. Historians who have mapped the frequency of animal trials note that they seem to spike during times of famine, widespread disease, or social unrest. It's during the moments of greatest anxiety that the need for a scapegoat is most acute. When things are going well, a pig getting into the grain store is an annoyance. When the village is on the brink of starvation, that same pig can become a criminal agent of Satan, deserving of a full-blown trial. The scholarly debate here is not about whether this was scapegoating, but about how conscious the participants were of this function. Did they know, on some level, that this was a psychological ritual, or did they fully believe in the literal guilt of the animals? The most likely answer is that the two are not mutually exclusive. They could genuinely believe the pig was guilty and derive immense psychological comfort from the ritual of its punishment. The ritual worked precisely because they believed in its literal truth. For the scapegoat mechanism to be effective, you cannot see it as a mere mechanism. You have to believe the goat truly carries your sins away. So as you watch these historical events, look past the strange costumes and formal language. See the vulnerable, frightened people at the center of it all. See their desperate need to make sense of a senseless world. The pig on the gallows and the cursed caterpillars are not just historical oddities. They are monuments to the enduring human struggle to impose order on chaos, to find justice in tragedy, and to find a guilty party to bear the burden of their fears. While pigs, rats, and insects were the most common defendants in these medieval courtrooms, the usual suspects of the animal kingdom, the long arm of the law did not stop there. The legal net was cast wide, and over the centuries, a veritable menagerie of creatures found themselves facing a judge. Exploring the sheer variety of accused animals gives you a sense of just how pervasive this worldview was. Let's start with the large and dangerous. Bulls and horses were frequent defendants in secular courts, for much the same reasons as pigs. A bull that gored a farmer or a horse that kicked a child to death was a prime candidate for a trial. These animals were powerful, valuable, and lived in close proximity to humans. When they caused harm, the act was treated as a capital crime. We have records from the 14th century of a bull being hanged for killing a man, with the legal documents noting the crime with the same gravity as if the perpetrator had been a human. The logic was identical to the pig trials. The animal had violated the peace of the community and had to be held accountable. Dogs, despite being man's best friend, were not immune. A dog that bit a person, particularly if the person died from the wound or from a subsequent infection like rabies, could be put on trial and sentenced to death. In one documented case from 15th century Switzerland, a dog was sentenced to be hanged alongside its owner, who was convicted of robbery. The court records don't specify the dog's exact crime, but it was likely deemed an accomplice. But the courts didn't just deal with domestic animals. The legal system was ambitious enough to take on the wild kingdom as well. In one bizarre case, a group of dolphins was put on trial in the port of Marseille, France. They were accused of damaging fishing nets and disrupting the local fishing industry. While the logistics of arresting a pod of dolphins are mind-boggling, the court proceeded, issuing a summons and likely judging them in absentia. The verdict, in this case, was likely a formal curse, ordering them to leave the waters. Even moles were not safe from prosecution. In the 15th century in the region of Tyrol, a community brought a case against the moles for destroying their fields by digging tunnels. The church court, in a move of classic judicial compromise, ordered the moles to move to a designated piece of land to help them on their way. The court offered the moles a letter of safe conduct to protect them from their enemies, presumably dogs and birds of prey, while they relocated. And then there were the donkeys. In 1750, in what is considered one of the very last animal trials, a man named Jacques Ferron was caught in a compromising position with his female donkey in the town of Anvise, France. Both Ferron and the donkey were arrested and charged with a serious crime. Ferron was swiftly found guilty and sentenced to death. The donkey, however, had a surprising number of supporters. This is a strange but true detail that highlights the intricate moral calculations of the time. The parish priest and several prominent citizens of Van Bees came forward to act as character witnesses for the donkey. They submitted a formal deposition to the court testifying that they had known the donkey for years and that she had always been a virtuous and well-behaved animal, never showing any signs of licentious behavior. They argued that she was the victim in this situation, not a willing participant, and had been forced into the act against her will. The court was so persuaded by this testimony that they acquitted the donkey. While her human partner was executed, the donkey was set free. This case is often cited as a late example of the system, showing that acquittal was a real possibility, especially if the animal had a good reputation. Historians looking at this wide range of animal defendants debate whether the type of animal influenced the trial. There seems to be a rough pattern. Large, domestic mammals like pigs and bulls were often tried in secular courts for specific, violent crimes, and the punishment was a physical execution mirroring human punishment. Smaller pests that acted in swarms, insects, rodents, slugs were the domain of the church courts. Their crime was collective and economic, and the punishment was a curse or excommunication. The wild animals in the more unusual cases, like the dolphins or the donkey, seemed to fall in a grey area, handled by whichever authority felt its domain had been violated. The sheer breadth of this practice reveals something fundamental about the medieval relationship with the natural world. It was not a world of detached, scientific observation. It was a world of intimate, constant, and often contentious interaction. Every creature, from the pig in your yard to the mole in your field, was a player in the grand social and moral drama of life. They were neighbors, and like any neighbors, sometimes you had to take them to court to resolve a dispute. The idea that some creatures were beneath the law simply didn't compute. It had lived and breathed in their world. It was subject to their rules. Of all the bizarre cases that fill the annals of animal trials, perhaps none is more strange, more revealing of the deep-seated anxieties of the time, than the trial of the rooster of Basel. This case, which took place in Switzerland in 1474, wasn't about murder or property damage. It was about a crime that struck at the very heart of the medieval understanding of nature, order, and demonic influence. The crime: a rooster was accused of laying an egg. Let that sink in for a moment. A rooster laying an egg. You have to imagine the scene. Someone in the town of Basel finds a small, yolkless egg in a rooster's coop. This is an impossibility, a flagrant violation of the laws of biology as they understood them. A rooster's job is to crow. A hen's job is to lay eggs. That is the divinely ordained order of the barnyard. For a rooster to lay an egg was as unnatural as the sun rising in the west. It was a monstrous act, a perversion of God's creation. The immediate conclusion was not that this was a strange biological anomaly. The immediate conclusion was that this was an act of witchcraft, a sign of the devil's hand at work. The rooster was not just a confused bird, it was a sorcerer in league with Satan. The rooster was promptly arrested and put on trial for its life. The prosecution laid out its case with deadly seriousness. They argued that this was no ordinary egg. According to a widely held and terrifying superstition, an egg laid by a rooster was the essential ingredient for creating a cockatrice. A cockatrice was a mythical beast of immense evil, a type of dragon or serpent with a deadly gaze. The legend stated that if a rooster's egg was hatched by a toad or a serpent, it would bring forth this monster, whose breath could wither plants and whose stare could kill a man instantly. The cockatrice was, in essence, a biological weapon of mass destruction from the depths of hell. Therefore, the rooster that laid the egg was not just a freak of nature, it was an agent of diabolical terror, attempting to unleash an apocalyptic monster upon the good Christian folk of Basel. The rooster was assigned a lawyer, as was proper procedure. You can only imagine the challenge facing this poor attorney. How do you defend a rooster against the charge of unnatural egg laying? The evidence, the egg itself, was presumably presented to the court. The lawyer likely tried his best, perhaps arguing that his client was the victim of a demonic trick, not a willing participant. Or maybe he tried to argue that the whole thing was a mistake, that a hen had laid the egg in the wrong place, that the fear in the courtroom would have been palpable and overwhelming. This case touched upon the deepest anxieties about hidden evil and the fragility of the natural world. In a time when the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural were porous, a rooster's egg was a terrifyingly real threat. The court found the rooster guilty of the heinous and unnatural crime of laying an egg. The sentence was death, but a simple beheading would not suffice. The crime was demonic, so the punishment had to be a form of ritual purification. The rooster, along with the demonic egg it had produced, was taken to a public square and burned at the stake, just as a human witch or heretic would be. The fire was seen as a cleansing agent, a way to utterly destroy the demonic taint and prevent the cockatrice from ever being born. Quirky and somewhat sad. Modern footnote to this story: biologists now know that under certain rare circumstances, such as a hormonal imbalance or an infection, a rooster can in fact produce a small, yolkless egg-like object. It is an exceedingly rare but natural biological anomaly. The pure rooster of Basel was not a demon, just a medical curiosity. So why did this one case provoke such an extreme reaction? Historians who study this period argue that the rooster trial is a perfect example of how animal trials could function as a proxy for social anxieties. The 15th century was a time of great upheaval. The Black Death had left deep scars, religious schisms were brewing, and there was a growing fear of witchcraft and heresy that would later explode into the great witch hunts. The world felt unstable and full of hidden dangers. The rooster's egg became a focal point for all this free-floating fear. It was a tangible symbol of a world turned upside down, of nature becoming unnatural. By putting the rooster on trial and ritually destroying it, the community of Basel was not just dealing with a strange bird. They were fighting back against the sense that their world was slipping into chaos. They were reasserting the correct order of nature. They were drawing a hard line in the sand and declaring, "This is natural, and that is unnatural. This is of God, and that is of the devil." The burning of the rooster was a public ceremony to restore the boundaries, to make nature behave itself again, and to reassure themselves that they were still in control. It was a desperate, and ultimately tragic, attempt to police reality itself. While we've been focused on the high drama of the courtroom and the deep theological anxieties, it's easy to forget that these trials were also, at their core, administrative and financial undertakings. Putting an animal on trial wasn't free. In fact, it could be a surprisingly expensive affair, and the meticulous court records that survive give us a fascinating, and often comical, glimpse into the mundane bureaucracy behind the bizarre spectacle. Let's break down the budget for a typical animal trial. So, for our murderous pig from the beginning of our story. First, there's the pre-trial detention. Once arrested, the pig couldn't just be left in the farmer's pen. It was a flight risk and a dangerous criminal. The animal had to be formally incarcerated. This meant keeping it at the local jail, the same place used for human offenders. This immediately incurred costs. The jailer needed to be paid for his services, and more importantly, the pig needed to be fed. Court account books from the period are filled with line items that read something like, "For the food and upkeep of one pig, held in the castle jail for a period of 10 days, 6 shillings. This created the absurd situation where the town was spending good money to keep an animal alive, specifically so they could legally execute it later. In some prolonged cases, especially those involving appeals, an animal could be on death row for weeks or even months, running up a considerable board and lodging bill, all at the public's expense or, more often, charged back to the animal's owner. Then, there are the legal fees. The court officials, the judge, the clerks, the bailiffs all had to be paid for their time. The prosecutor, who brought the case on behalf of the community, was compensated, and as we know, the defense lawyer was also paid for his professional services. These were not small sums. A skilled jurist like Bartholomew Chasney would have commanded a handsome fee for defending a swarm of rats. The owner of a convicted animal was often presented with a hefty legal bill that could be financially ruinous. Next, we have the costs of the execution itself. The public executioner was a salaried professional, but he often received a bonus for each execution he performed. This fee was formally recorded in the town's financial ledger. An entry might read to the master executioner, for the hanging of oneself, 5 shillings. There were also material costs. The rope for the gallows wasn't free. If the gallows needed repairs, a carpenter had to be paid. If the sentence was burning at the stake, as with the rooster of Basel, the wood for the pyre had to be purchased and transported. Here's a particularly strange and wonderful detail from the expense reports. In one 14th century French case, the executioner was paid a bonus for outfitting the convicted pig with a new pair of gloves before leading it to the gallows. The record doesn't explain why, but the act of putting human garments on the animal was part of the ritual of humanizing it for the execution. The court, in its bureaucratic fastidiousness, approved and paid for this final, absurd accessory. So who footed the bill for all this primarily? The owner of the animal. This was one of the reasons owners would sometimes formally disown their animal in court. It wasn't just to distance themselves from the crime, but to avoid the crushing debt of the legal process. If the animal was a stray or a wild animal, the cost was typically borne by the local lord or the town council, paid for out of tax revenues, for the ecclesiastical trials against pests. The church often covered the costs, or they were paid for by a special tithe levied on the community that brought the complaint. Historians who specialize in economic history find these records invaluable. They debate whether the high cost of these trials contributed to their eventual decline. Some argue that as local governments became more centralized and budget-conscious, the sheer expense and administrative headache of trying a pig started to seem less and less sensible. It was simply more cost-effective to empower a local official to dispatch a problem animal on the spot, without the pomp and circumstance of a full trial. The bottom line, in essence, may have been a more powerful force for change than any philosophical argument. This financial angle adds a layer of mundane reality to the whole affair. It reminds us that these were not just abstract theological dramas, they were government operations. They required paperwork, requisitions, and balanced budgets. It's amusing to imagine a town clerk, quid in hand, meticulously logging the expense of one day's bread for a criminal pig, and then turning to the next line item about repairing a bridge. For him, it was all just part of the job of administering a medieval town, a world where the sacred and the profane, the judicial and the financial, the deeply serious and the utterly absurd, were all tangled up in the same ledger. As the costs mounted and the procedures became more elaborate, the animal trial evolved into something more than just a legal or religious event. It became a form of public theater, a solemn spectacle that captivated the entire community. This wasn't entertainment in the modern sense of the word. No one was eating popcorn and laughing. It was a serious, mandatory civic ritual, and your attendance was part of your duty as a member of the community. Picture the day of a public execution of a convicted animal. It's a major event, a break from the monotonous rhythm of agricultural life. The town square, normally a place of commerce and casual gossip, is transformed into an outdoor stage. People gather from the town and the surrounding countryside. They are not there for a good time, they are there to bear witness. The centerpiece of this spectacle is the procession. The condemned animal, be it a pig, a bull, or a donkey, is led from the jail to the place of execution. This is not a quick, discreet affair. It is a slow, formal parade through the main streets of the town. The animal is often dressed in human-like clothing, such as the waistcoat or gloves we've mentioned, a key theatrical element that visually separates it from other animals and marks it as the condemned. The procession is led by court bailiffs and guards. The executioner, often masked or hooded, is a figure of terrifying importance. The magistrate and other town officials might follow, reinforcing the official, state-sanctioned nature of the event. The whole thing is designed to be imposing, a moving display of the power of the law. The crowds roll as to watch, and their watching is a form of participation. Their collective presence validates the verdict. By standing there, in solemn silence, they are all co-signing the court's decision. They are affirming that this is what we, as a community, do when the sacred order is violated. It reinforces their shared values and their collective identity. In a world with no mass media, these public rituals were how society talked to itself about what it believed in. This ritual also served as a powerful tool for social education, especially for children. A father might bring his son to watch the hanging of a pig that killed an infant. He wouldn't do it to traumatize the child, but to teach him a series of profound lessons. Lesson 1: This is the terrible consequence of sin and transgression. Lesson 2: This is the power of the law to restore order. Lesson 3: This is your place in the community, as a witness to and participant in its justice. It was a visceral, unforgettable civics lesson. Here's a peculiar detail that underscores the performative nature of these events: the role of the animal's owner. In many cases, the owner was required to attend the execution of their own animal. Sometimes, they were even required to publicly renounce the animal one last time before the sentence was carried out. This was a form of public penance, a way for the owner to demonstrate to the community that they accepted the court's verdict and were severing their ties with the criminal element that had, until recently, been their property. It was a final, dramatic severing of the bond between man and beast. Historians who study public rituals and performances are fascinated by animal trials. They argue about the primary function of the show. Was it about deterrence? It's hard to say if other pigs were really deterred, but it certainly deterred humans from letting their animals run amok. If you knew your pig could land you with a huge fine and public humiliation, you'd be more likely to keep it penned in. Or was the spectacle more about reinforcing the social hierarchy? Absolutely. The trial and execution were a clear demonstration of human power over the natural world. In a time when nature often seemed to have the upper hand through feminine trade, this was a ritual that put humanity firmly back in the driver's seat. It was a performance of total domination. We, the humans, are so in charge that we can subject the very beasts of the field to our laws, our quotes, and our gallows. This perspective helps explain why the practice eventually faded. As other forms of public spectacle arose: theaters, public festivals, more elaborate religious processions. The animal trial may have lost some of its unique appeal as a community gathering. More importantly, as the worldview shifted towards a more scientific and less symbolic understanding of nature, the idea of a pig as a moral actor on a public stage started to seem less serious and more farcical. The show's core premise lost its believability, and without that, the spectacle becomes empty. But for a few centuries, the town square was a stage, and the animal on trial was the star of a grim but powerful play about justice, order, and humanity's place in the cosmos. At the heart of any trial, whether it's in a modern courtroom or a medieval hall, is the concept of evidence. The court needs proof to reach a verdict. But what constituted evidence in a trial where the defendant was a pig or a swarm of weevils? This is where the medieval legal system reveals its fascinating, and to us, deeply strange, blend of rational procedure and ingrained superstition. On the one hand, the courts were surprisingly meticulous about gathering what we would recognize as empirical evidence. In the case of the murderer's sow, the prosecution would have called eyewitnesses, people who saw the pig near the deceased child, people who heard the screams, people who could testify to the pig's location before and after the event. The court would hear their testimony, and the defense lawyer would cross-examine them. Just as in a human trial, physical evidence was also presented. The prosecutor might point to the bloodstains on the pig's snout as proof of its guilt. The child's wounded body would have been examined, and the nature of the injuries would be described to the court to show that they were consistent with an animal attack. In the trials of pests, villagers would bring in physical proof of the damage: the gnawed crops, the infested grain, to demonstrate the scale of the crime. This part of the process was, in its own way, quite forensic. They were trying to establish a chain of cause and effect based on observation. But this rational approach was built on a foundation of deeply held beliefs that allowed for other kinds of evidence that we would instantly dismiss. The most powerful of these was the idea of the unnatural act itself. The crime's unnaturalness was, in itself, considered evidence of guilt. For a pig to kill a human was a violation of the great chain of being. This inversion of the natural order was not just the context of the crime, it was proof of its malicious, and possibly demonic, character. The act itself was so heinous that it testified against the perpetrator. This is even clearer in the case of the rooster of Basel. The primary piece of evidence against the rooster was the egg. The simple existence of this unnatural object was all the proof the court needed to infer demonic intent. They didn't need to prove the rooster had signed a pact with the devil. The egg was the pact, made visible. Furthermore, an animal's reputation could be entered as a form of character evidence. We saw this in the case of the acquitted donkey in Van Vies, whose neighbors testified to have virtuous character. Conversely, if a bull was known to be aggressive, or if a dog had a history of biting, this could be brought before the court as evidence of its inherently criminal disposition. The animal's past behavior was seen as a reliable indicator of its moral state. And here's a wonderfully bizarre piece of legal theory that sometimes came into play trial by ordeal. While more common in the earlier Middle Ages and for human defendants, the logic of the ordeal sometimes cast a shadow over animal trials. Trial by ordeal was the belief that God would perform a miracle to reveal the guilt or innocence of an accused party. For example, an accused person might have to carry a hot iron bar, and if the wound healed cleanly, they were deemed innocent. The same logic could be applied, at least philosophically, to animals. A formal curse from a bishop was a kind of ordeal. If the plague of locusts vanished after the curse, it was seen as divine proof that the curse was just and the locusts were guilty. The outcome of the punishment became retroactive evidence of the crime. The debate among historians here is fascinating. How did the legal professionals, the trained lawyers and judges, reconcile these two types of evidence? Did they see a contradiction between the testimony of an eyewitness and the evidence of a rooster's unnatural egg? Most scholars argue that they saw no contradiction at all. In their worldview, the physical and the metaphysical were seamlessly intertwined. The blood on the pig's snout and the demonic nature of its crime were not two different things, they were two sides of the same coin. The physical evidence confirmed the spiritual transgression, and the spiritual transgression explained the physical evidence. This created a legal system that was incredibly difficult for a defendant to beat. The very act you were accused of was itself evidence of your guilt. The system had a built-in confirmation bias. The pig was on trial because it did something unnatural, and the fact that it did something unnatural proved it was the kind of creature that deserved to be on trial. It was a closed loop of logic, one that a defense lawyer like Bartholomew Chasney could only pry open with procedural tricks, not by challenging the fundamental worldview of the court. So when you imagine the scene, don't picture a clear line between fact and fear. Picture a courtroom where they are one and the same. The evidence presented is a tapestry woven from witness statements, physical artifacts, community gossip, and profound theological anxiety. It's a legal process where a bloodstain and a bad omen carry equal weight, and where the most damning evidence of all is that something happened that just wasn't supposed to happen. We have spent a lot of time with animals in the defendant's dock, but the medieval legal system's relationship with the animal kingdom was even more complex and strained. In some rare but historically documented instances, the roles were reversed. Animals were not just brought to court as the accused, they were sometimes called upon to act as witnesses. This concept pushes the boundaries of belief even further, but it operated on a very specific and powerful medieval legal idea, the judicial duel, also known as trial by combat. This was a method of resolving a legal dispute, particularly a criminal accusation where there were no other witnesses, by having the accuser and the accused fight each other. The winner of the duel was deemed to be telling the truth, as it was believed that God would not allow the righteous party to be defeated. It was a lawsuit settled by divine intervention through violence. So where does an animal witness fit? In the most famous and enduring story of this phenomenon is the legend of the dog of Montargis. While the story has been embellished over time and exists in many versions, its historical core is thought to date back to 14th century France. The story goes like this: a French knight named Aubry de Montdidier was found murdered in a forest near the town of Montargis. There were no human witnesses to the crime. The only one present was the knight's royal hound, the greyhound. The knight's friends and family noticed that the dog, normally gentle, showed extreme aggression towards one specific man, another knight named Macaire, who was a known rival of the murdered Aubry. Whatever Macaire was near, the dog would bark, snarl, and try to attack him. The dog's persistent and specific animosity was so striking that it was interpreted as a form of testimony. The dog, it was believed, was acting as a silent accuser, pointing out the murderer through its divinely inspired instinct. The story reached the ears of the King of France himself, Charles V. Intrade. The king summoned both Macaire and the dog to his court. The dog's behavior was consistent. It was docile with everyone except Macaire, whom it immediately tried to attack. Convinced that this was a sign from God, the king declared that since the dog could not speak to give testimony and Macaire could not be convicted on a dog's bark alone, the matter would be settled by a trial by combat. But it would be a judicial duel, and like any other, the fight would be between the human knight, Macaire, and the dog. This is the kind of detail that sounds like pure folklore, but it fits within the logic of the time. The duel was not seen as a test of strength between a man and a dog, but as a formal appeal to God. God would strengthen the arm more in this case, the jaw of the righteous party, to reveal the truth. A special arena was constructed for the event. Macaire was armed with a club, and the dog was given an empty barrel to use as a refuge. The fight began. The dog, quick and agile, dodged the knight's blows and eventually managed to leap at his throat, pinning him to the ground. Unable to escape the dog's grip and facing certain death, Macaire, in his terror, confessed to the murder. The duel was stopped. Macaire was promptly executed for his crime, and the dog was celebrated as a hero, a champion of justice. Now historians debate the literal truth of every detail of this story. Is it a faithful account of a real event, or a popular legend that was later written down as fact? The consensus is that it's likely a fusion of both. The core event, a judicial duel sanctioned to resolve an accusation based on a dog's behavior, is plausible within the context of 14th century legal practice. The dramatic confession and the perfect outcome might be later embellishments to make for a better story. Whether fact or legend, the story of the Dog of Montargis was incredibly influential. It was told and retold for centuries as a powerful morality tale about loyalty, justice, and the belief that even the dumb animals could be used by God as instruments of truth. It reinforces the idea that the boundary between human and animal was not as rigid as we see it. An animal could be a criminal defendant, but it could also be a star witness for the prosecution. Its instincts seen as a more reliable guide to the truth than the deceitful words of a human. This puts the entire practice of animal trials in a new light. The system wasn't just about punishing animals. It was about a deep-seated belief that animals were active participants in the moral universe. They were so integrated into the fabric of justice that they could play almost any role the legal drama required: perpetrator, victim, and in the rarest of cases, the key witness whose testimony, delivered through a bark and a bite, could bring a murderer to justice. For centuries, the practice of trying animals in court, whether secular or ecclesiastical, was a largely unquestioned part of the European legal and social landscape. It was simply how things were done, but no system, no matter how deeply entrenched, is immune to critique. As the Middle Ages began to wane and the first glimmers of the Renaissance and the Reformation appeared on the horizon, a few brave and thoughtful individuals began to plant the seeds of doubt. They started asking a question that seems obvious to us, but was radical for their time: is this whole thing actually a little bit ridiculous? The earliest critiques did not come from a place of scientific rationalism, but from within the religious and legal establishments themselves. These weren't atheists mocking the system, they were devout theologians and jurists who began to find the practice theologically unsound or legally problematic. One of the first lines of attack was aimed at the ecclesiastical trials of pests. Some theologians began to argue that the act of cursing and excommunicating a swarm of locusts was, in fact, a form of blasphemy. Their reasoning was subtle but powerful. God, they argued, sometimes sends plagues of insects as a divine punishment for humanity's sins. A plague might be a test of faith or a call to repentance. If this is the case, then for a mere human court, even a church court, to stand up and legally command the plague to go away is an act of profound arrogance. It is humanity trying to countermand a direct order from God. It's like receiving a punishment from your father, and then turning around and suing the rod he used to discipline you. This argument was dangerous because it used the system's own theological logic against it. It didn't deny God's power, it amplified it to a point where the trials looked like an insult to that power. One prominent 16th century German Catholic theologian, Martin Platz ch. argued that instead of cursing the caterpillars, the faithful should turn inward, pray, and examine their own sins to understand why God had sent the creatures in the first place. The solution was not a lawsuit, but repentance. Another line of critique, this time from the legal side, came from jurists who were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the logical knots the trials created. We saw a perfect example of this with Bartholomew Chesney. While he famously participated in the system, his brilliant defense of the rats of Alton also served as a reductio ad absurdum. By taking the court's premises so seriously, he exposed their inherent absurdity. His argument, while technically correct, made the whole process look silly. Other lawyers and judges began to quietly echo this sentiment. The endless procedural delays, the absurd arguments about cat-related security risks, it all started to tarnish the dignity of the court. Here's a specific, if less dramatic, example of this growing skepticism. A 16th century Spanish jurist named Diego de Covarrubias, when writing about legal theory, gently mocked the practice. He questioned how a court could claim jurisdiction over creatures like flies or rats that did not recognize its authority and could not understand its verdict. He didn't rail against it, but his tone was one of sophisticated, academic doubt. He was essentially raising an eyebrow at the whole affair, suggesting it was beneath the notice of serious legal thinkers. This growing skepticism is a point of lively debate among historians. Why did it start to emerge in the 15th and 16th centuries specifically? There's no single answer. Some scholars point to the influence of Renaissance humanism, which began to place a greater emphasis on human reason and a more critical reading of ancient texts, including the Bible. Humanist scholars were more likely to see the world in terms of natural cause and effect, rather than constant divine or demonic intervention. Other historians connect it to the turmoil of the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation challenged the authority and rituals of the Catholic Church on many fronts. Protestant leaders, like Martin Luther, were highly critical of what they saw as the superstitious and magical thinking embedded in many Catholic practices. The ritual of a bishop cursing a field of weevils was exactly the kind of priestly magic that they rejected. They advocated a more direct, personal relationship with God, one that didn't require the intermediary of a legal curse. While some Protestantarians continued the trials for a time, the practice found much more fertile ground in the Catholic world of the Counter-Reformation, which often doubled down on its traditional rituals. These early seeds of doubt did not end the practice overnight. Animal trials would continue, in some places, for another 200 years. But the foundation was cracking. This solid, unquestioning consensus that had supported the tradition for centuries was beginning to dissolve. Theologians were questioning its piety. Lawyers were questioning its logic. And the slow, inexorable shift in the European worldview was beginning to make the sight of a pig in a waistcoat look less like an act of solemn justice and more like a relic of a bygone, superstitious age. The intellectual groundwork for the end was being laid. The intellectual seeds of doubt that were planted by theologians and jurists began to sprout into a full-blown philosophical challenge in the 17th century. And if we had to nominate one single person whose ideas did more to dismantle the philosophical foundations of animal trials than any other, It would be a Frenchman with a magnificent mustache and a world-changing idea, René Descartes. Descartes, often called the father of modern philosophy, was not directly concerned with the legal rights of pigs. He was trying to build a new system of knowledge from the ground up, based on radical doubt and pure reason. But in doing so, he came up with a theory about animals that would echo through the halls of science and law for centuries. It was a simple, powerful, and, for the animals, a devastating idea: animals are machines. Let's unpack this. You're sitting by the fire, watching your cat. The cat purrs. It rubs against your leg. It seems to show affection. You see its behavior as evidence of an inner life, emotions, thoughts, a consciousness, however simple. Descartes would tell you that you are mistaken. You are being fooled by a complex biological automaton. In his discourse on the method, Descartes argued for a sharp, absolute distinction between humans and animals. What made humans unique, he said, was the possession of a rational soul race called Gideoness, or a thinking thing, which was a gift from God. This soul gave us language, reason, and self-awareness. Animals, on the other hand, did not have this soul. They were part of the physical, material world res extensa, or an extended thing. They were, in his view, nothing more than intricate biological clockwork. According to Descartes, an animal's cry of pain is no different from the chime of a clock when it's struck. A dog's wagging tail is no different from the whirring of gears. These are automatic, mechanical responses to external stimuli. The animal has no thoughts, no feelings, no consciousness, no inner experience of the world. It is a machine made of flesh and bone. When a pig squeals, it's not feeling pain, its body is simply producing a sound in response to a physical stimulus, much like a violin string vibrates when plucked. This idea, known as the beast-machine theory, was revolutionary and deeply controversial, but you can immediately see how it strikes a fatal blow to the entire concept of the animal trial. The whole premise of trying an animal for a crime rests on the belief that the animal is a moral agent. It has to have some level of awareness, some capacity for choice, some susceptibility to demonic influence. It has to be, in some sense, a person in the legal drama. But if an animal is just a machine, then putting it on trial is as absurd as putting a malfunctioning cuckoo clock on trial for disturbing the peace. You can't blame a machine for its programming. A rock that rolls down a hill and kills a man is not a murderer. According to Descartes, a pig that kills an infant is no different. It's just a tragic mechanical event. This Cartesian view provided a powerful, modern, scientific argument against the old ways. A lawyer arguing against an animal trial no longer had to rely on subtle theological points or procedural tricks. He could now stand up and say, "Your Honor, to try this pig is a philosophical error. It has no more soul or moral culpability than the hammer that the blacksmith uses to shape iron." A fascinating, if grim, detail from this period is how Cartesian philosophy was used to justify the dissection of living animals for scientific research. Scientists and philosophers who followed Descartes felt they could cut into a living dog without moral qualms because the dog's howls were not cries of agony, they were merely the hydraulic hisses of a complex machine. This shows how completely the beast-machine theory dehumanized, or rather, de-animalized the animal kingdom. Now, historians debate how quickly and widely Descartes' ideas spread and directly influenced the courts. It wasn't as if judges read Descartes one day and immediately stopped trying pigs the next. The decline was a slow, gradual process. However, Cartesian philosophy seeped into the intellectual atmosphere of Europe. It became the fashionable, modern way to think about the world. It armed the intellectual elite, the lawyers, judges, and academics with a powerful new vocabulary and a framework that made the old rituals seem not just wrong, but intellectually embarrassing. The belief in a pig's demonic possession started to look like an old wives' tale in the face of this new, enlightened mechanical philosophy. The animal trial, once a solemn ritual to restore cosmic order, began to be reframed as a relic of a superstitious, pre-scientific past. Descartes, without ever writing a word about a specific court case, had effectively removed the ghost from the machine, and in doing so, he granted every animal in Europe a permanent get-out-of-jail-free card. They could no longer be guilty, because they could no longer be. René Descartes loaded the philosophical weapon that would bring down the animal trial. The Enlightenment of the 18th century pulled the trigger. This broad intellectual and cultural movement, which championed reason, science, and individual liberty, created a climate in which the practice of trying animals simply could not survive. It began to look not just irrational, but backward, uncivilized, and frankly, a bit embarrassing for a modern nation to engage in. The Enlightenment built directly on the foundations laid by figures like Descartes. The world was increasingly seen not as a stage for a supernatural drama, but as a rational, ordered system governed by natural laws that could be understood through observation and experiment. The scientific revolution was in full swing. Isaac Newton had described the laws of motion and universal gravitation, showing that the universe operated like a grand, predictable clockwork. This way of thinking rapidly filtered down from the scientific elite to the broader culture. In this new intellectual light, a plague of locusts was no longer seen as a diabolical curse to be fought with a lawsuit. It was a biological event, with natural causes perhaps related to weather patterns or breeding cycles, and it required a scientific solution, not a legal one. The burgeoning field of natural history, led by figures like the Comte de Buffon in France, began classifying and studying animals with a new, systematic rigor. Animals were objects of scientific inquiry, not potential criminals. To put a weevil on trial started to seem as absurd as putting gravity on trial for making things fall. This shift in worldview was accompanied by a major transformation in legal thinking. Enlightenment thinkers like Cesare Beccaria in Italy and Voltaire in France argued for a more rational, humane, and efficient system of justice. They attacked torture, secret trials, and cruel and unusual punishments. They advocated for the idea that the purpose of law was not to enact divine retribution, but to maintain social order and deter crime in the most rational way possible. In this new legal framework, the animal trial was a perfect example of everything that was wrong with the old system. It was irrational, based on superstition rather than evidence. It was inefficient, wasting the court's time and money on a pointless spectacle. And it was, to the sophisticated soul-mongers of Paris and London, a symbol of the Gothic barbarism of the Dark Ages. Voltaire, the great satirist and public intellectual of the French Enlightenment, famously used his razor-sharp wit to mock the follies of the old regime, and the animal trial was a perfect target. He and other writers would refer to these trials with the tone of amused disbelief, presenting them as proof of the ignorance and superstition of their ancestors. This is a crucial shift. The animal trial moves from being a current event to being a historical curiosity, a funny story you tell about how backward people used to be. Once something becomes the butt of a joke for the cultural elite, its days as a serious practice are numbered. A quirky detail that illustrates this changing attitude can be found in the encyclopedias of the era. The Great French Encyclopedia, the landmark project of the Enlightenment, included entries on legal procedures. When discussing the old animal trials, the tone is one of condescension. The authors describe the practice as a historical oddity, a product of a credulous and unenlightened age. They were cataloguing it not as living law, but as a fossil, a relic of a dead intellectual world. Historians who study this transition point to a complex interplay of factors. It wasn't just one thing, but a perfect storm of intellectual, social, and legal changes. Science provided a new explanation for the world. Legal reform provided a new vision for justice. And a new sense of historical progress provided a new narrative in which the animal trial was cast as a villain of the past. It's debated whether the change happened from the top down or the bottom up. Did the elite philosophers and jurists convince everyone else it was silly, or did the common people themselves gradually lose faith in the efficacy of the rituals? The answer is likely both. As new agricultural techniques and early forms of pest control became more widespread, a farmer might find that a new type of crop rotation was more effective at dealing with weevils than a lawsuit. As the general level of education slowly rose, belief in a rooster's egg creating a cockatrice might have waned. The animal trial didn't end on a specific day. It simply faded away. Like a mist burning off in the morning sun, it died a slow death from 1,000 cuts, the mockery of satirists, the logic of philosophers, the classifications of scientists, and the common sense of a world that was learning to solve its problems with tools other than a gavel and a curse. The courtroom, once a stage for cosmic battles, was becoming a more sober, rational place, with no room in the dock for a pig. Like a river drying up, the strange tradition of the animal trial didn't end abruptly in a single, final cascade. Instead, it dwindled over the 18th and early 19th centuries, becoming a series of disconnected, increasingly bizarre puddles before evaporating completely into the pages of history. The last recorded trials are fascinating because they show the practice in its death throes, often clashing awkwardly with the more modern sensibilities of the time. We've already mentioned the 1750 trial of Jacques Ferrand and his donkey in Banvise, France. This case is often cited as one of the last classic animal trials. It had all the traditional elements: a crime against morality, a joint trial of human and animal, and a verdict based on the animal's character. The acquittal of the donkey, based on character references from the townspeople, shows the old logic still functioning. But the very fact that it happened as late as 1750, in a suburb of Paris, the epicenter of the Enlightenment, made it seem like a strange anachronism even at the time. It was a piece of the 15th century that had somehow time-traveled into the Age of Reason. After this, the train of formal, state-sanctioned trials goes cold in most of Western Europe. The legal systems had been reformed. The philosophical ground had shifted, and the practice was effectively extinct. However, in more remote, rural, and traditional pockets of the continent, the old ways died harder. The last known official trial of an animal in Europe is widely believed to have taken place in Switzerland in 1845. The details of this case are scant and debated by historians, but the story holds that a group of men were on trial, and their dogs were co-accused, possibly in a case of poaching or a similar crime where the dogs were essential participants. This late date is remarkable, showing just how long these ideas could persist in isolated alpine communities, far from the influence of the intellectual hub. But the most compelling and well-documented last gasps of the tradition come not from trials of large mammals, but from the old ecclesiastical practice of fighting pests with lawsuit in the early 19th century in Brazil, which was still culturally and legally influenced by its Portuguese Catholic heritage. A fascinating case unfolded. A Franciscan monastery was being plagued by termites, or capin, which were destroying the wooden structures of their buildings. Instead of calling an exterminator, the monks fell back on the old tradition. They initiated a formal lawsuit against the termites. A lawyer was appointed to represent the pests. He argued, in classic Chasney style, that the termites had a prior claim to the land, having been created by God and settled there long before the monks arrived. The judge, in a verdict that Solomon would have admired, ordered the monks to provide a new, suitable home for the termites in a nearby patch of forest and then ordered the termites to relocate there under threat of excommunication. It's a near-perfect echo of the street Julian Weevil case from 300 years earlier, playing out in the New World. Even later, in the 1862, there's a recorded case from a village in the Ottoman Empire in what is now modern-day Turkey where a local Christian community brought a lawsuit against a plague of locusts. The ecclesiastical court heard the case and issued a formal curse. This particular incident as a point of academic discussion: was this a true survival of the medieval European tradition, or a parallel practice that developed independently within the legal structures of the Eastern Orthodox Church? The answer remains unclear, but it shows the enduring appeal of using legal and religious ritual to confront natural disasters. These final cases are telling. They all take place on the geographic or cultural peripheries of the Western world. They are echoes of a practice that has died at the core. They feel less like a living legal tradition and more like the performance of a folk ritual, a custom that people continue out of habit long after the original reasons have been forgotten. The slow fade out of the animal trial marks the final victory of a modern, scientific worldview over a symbolic, theological one. The world had been disenchanted. A pig was now just a pig, a source of bacon and leather, not a potential murderer. A termite was an insect, a problem for a carpenter, not a defendant for a lawyer. The law had narrowed its focus, concentrating only on the one animal it now deemed truly capable of reason, malice, and guilt, the human being. The strange, centuries-long conversation between the law and the animal kingdom was finally, officially, over. So here we are, at the end of this strange journey. Looking back from our 21st century vantage point, we've walked through muddy medieval streets, sat in cold stone courtrooms, and listened to lawyers defend rats and judges sentence pigs. The entire history feels like a fever dream, a collection of impossible stories. How can we even begin to understand a mindset so profoundly different from our own? Why does this specific piece of history feel so alien, so utterly unbelievable to us now? The first and most obvious reason is the scientific wall that now separates us from them. We live on the other side of Darwin, genetics, and behavioral psychology. We understand that an animal's actions are governed by instinct, biology, and conditioned responses. The idea of moral culpability for a pig is a category error in our world. It's like asking what color the number 7 is. We have a firm, scientifically backed understanding of the impassable gulf between human rational thought and animal instinct. For us, the based machine theory, in a modified form. 1. Animals are not machines, but they are biological systems, not moral agents. This scientific certainty makes their legal reasoning seem not just wrong, but nonsensical. Secondly, our relationship with the law has fundamentally changed. We see law as a secular, functional tool for regulating human society. Its purpose is pragmatic to ensure safety, protect property, and resolve disputes. We have systematically stripped it of its magical and theological dimensions. A modern judge would be laughed out of their courtroom if they cited scripture as a legal precedent or sentenced a defendant with a curse. Their world saw as a sacred instrument for restoring cosmic order. We see it as a civic instrument for maintaining public order. That difference is colossal. But perhaps the most profound change is in our relationship with the natural world itself. We live in a profoundly disenchanted world. For most of us, nature is something separate from our daily lives. It's a place we visit on weekends apart. The hiking trail. It's something we watch on a documentary. Our food comes from a grocery store, neatly packaged and disconnected from the living animal. They lived in a world where nature was an immediate, powerful, and often terrifying presence. Their pigs weren't abstract sources of bacon, they were large, powerful, semi-feral animals wandering their streets. Their livelihood didn't depend on a salary, it depended on the whims of rainfall and the biological success of their crops against a million hungry insects. They were locked in a constant, intimate, and adversarial relationship with animals, and because of this intimacy, they anthropomorphized them. They gave them intentions, personalities, and moral standing. It was a way of making sense of their complex and dangerous coexistence. We, in our sanitized, urbanized world, have lost that intimate connection, and with it, the tendency to see a moral agent in the eyes of a farm animal. A quirky but illuminating modern parallel is how we talk to our pets. We tell our dog he's a good boy or scold our cat for being naughty. We assign moral qualities to their actions. Of course, we know on a rational level they aren't making moral choices, but emotionally, we can't help it. This is a faint, sentimental echo of the medieval mindset. They just took that instinct and applied it with the full force of their legal and religious systems. Historians are still actively debating what the animal trials ultimately reveal about the societies that practice them. Are they a sign of a primitive, superstitious mind? Some early modern historians certainly saw it that way, using it as a stick to beat the Dark Ages with. But a more modern and empathetic view is emerging. Scholars now tend to see the trials not as a sign of stupidity, but as a sign of a deeply held desire for justice and order in a chaotic world. They show a society that took its own legal and moral principles so seriously that it applied them universally, to every creature under its dominion. It was a world that believed in a universal moral law, one that even a pig was obliged to follow. In its own strange way, the animal trial is a testament to their unwavering, if bizarrely applied, commitment to the idea of a just universe. Looking back, we might not understand their methods, but we can recognize the deeply human longing that drove them, the need to believe that even when something terrible happens, there is a reason, there is a culprit, and there is a way to make things right again. You might think that this whole bizarre chapter of legal history has been sealed shut, a dusty and forgotten tome with no relevance to our modern world, and for the most part, you'd be right. You're not going to see a golden retriever on trial for theft anytime soon. But if you look closely, in the quiet corners and subtle phrasings of our own legal system, you can find the faintest echoes, the ghostly reverberations, of the ideas that animated the medieval animal trials. The most direct modern successor is the concept of the dangerous dog law, which exists in many countries and cities around the world. Think about how these laws work. A dog bites someone, a legal process is initiated. There is a hearing, a sort of mini-trial. Evidence is presented, testimony from the victim, the dog's owner, and perhaps animal control officers. The dog's past behavior, its reputation, is taken into account. Is this its first offense? Is it a member of a breed deemed inherently aggressive? Based on this evidence, a judge or a tribunal makes a ruling. The dog might be sentenced to be muzzled in public, to be confined to its owner's property, or in the most serious cases, to be euthanized. Now let's be clear, our modern legal system does not believe the dog is morally guilty. The legal responsibility lies with the owner. The process is understood as a public safety measure, not a retributive one. We are managing a risk, not punishing a sin. And yet, the structure of the procedure is eerily familiar. An animal commits an act of harm. The community responds with a formal legal process. The animal's individual history and character are assessed, and a sentence is handed down that can include the animal's death. It is, in essence, the ghost of the secular animal trial, stripped of its theology and dressed in the modern language of risk management. Another faint echo can be found in the legal concept of attractive nuisance. This is a doctrine in tort law that holds a property owner responsible for injuries to children who are attracted to something dangerous on their property, like an unfenced swimming pool. Now, apply this logic to an animal. Some modern lawsuits have argued that an owner of a vicious animal they know to be dangerous can be held liable if that animal harms someone, even on their own property. Here, the animal itself is treated as a kind of living nuisance, a dangerous condition that the owner has a duty to control. This is very similar to the medieval concept where the owner of a murderous pig was fined for failing to control his dangerous property. A particularly quirky and specific modern remnant is the official pardon of the turkey that takes place at the White House every Thanksgiving. The President of the United States formally pardons a live turkey, saving it from becoming Thanksgiving dinner. It's played as a light-hearted photo opportunity, a fun national tradition. But what is it? Really, it's a formal, public ceremony where the head of state uses his legal power of clemency on an animal. It's a secular ritual that playfully uses the language of law and justice in relation to an animal destined for slaughter. It is, in its own way, a tiny, cheerful descendant of the same worldview that could sentence an animal to death. It acknowledges, even if only as a joke, that an animal can be a subject of a legalistic pronouncement. The debate among legal historians is how much of this is conscious lineage versus parallel evolution. Did modern dangerous dog laws directly evolve from the old trial system? Probably not. They were more likely reinvented in the 19th and 20th centuries to deal with the problems of urban life. But they follow a similar logical path, because they are trying to solve a similar problem. How does a human community use its legal system to deal with a harmful animal? The persistence of these echoes shows us that the core dilemma of the animal trials has never really gone away. We still live alongside animals. They can still cause harm. And we still feel the need to respond to that harm with a structured, rational, and legally sanctioned process. We've just changed the vocabulary. We no longer talk about sin and demonic possession. We talk about public safety, liability, and risk. But the basic framework, the hearing, the verdict is a quiet, almost invisible monument to the time when our ancestors saw nothing wrong with putting a pig in the dock and asking it to answer for its crimes. As our journey through this strange landscape of legal history comes to a close, we can step back and see the animal trial not as a single, bizarre practice, but as a complex tapestry woven from three fundamental human needs: the need for justice, the need for order, and the need for community. Understanding these three threads helps us finally grasp why, for so many centuries, putting animals on trial made perfect sense. First and foremost was the pursuit of justice. The medieval mind was saturated with the concept of a just God and a just universe. They believed deeply that actions have consequences, that good is rewarded and evil is punished. A crime was not just a social infraction, it was a tear in the moral fabric of the cosmos. For that fabric to be mended, justice had to be done, and it had to be seen to be done. The death of a child at the jaws of a pig was a profound injustice. To simply kill the pig in a field would be vengeance, a private act. But a trial with its solemn procedures, its arguments, its verdict transformed that act of vengeance into an act of justice. It elevated the killing into a righteous restoration of the moral balance. The process was everything. It satisfied the deep psychological need to believe that they lived in a universe where wrongs were righted, not just ignored. The second driving force was the relentless quest for order in a world that constantly threatened to descend into chaos. Life was precarious, famine, plague, and war were not abstract concepts, they were recurring, terrifying realities. In the face of such overwhelming and uncontrollable forces, people clung to rituals that created a semblance of control. The animal trial was one of the most powerful of these rituals. It took a chaotic event, a pest infestation, a random animal attack, and imposed a human-made order upon it. The trial followed a script. It had clear rules, defined roles, and a predictable sequence of events. It was a structured, rational response to an unstructured, irrational world. By subjecting a swarm of locusts to the rules of canon law, the community was symbolically asserting its power over the forces of chaos. They were shouting into the void, "Even you, the crawling chaos, must obey our rules." This is why the procedural correctness was so important. The point wasn't just to get to a guilty verdict, the point was to follow the procedure. The ritual of the trial itself was the victory. It was a way of building a small, walled garden of human order in the middle of a vast, untamed wilderness of natural chaos. Finally, the animal trial was a powerful act of community building. A shared trauma, like the death of a child, can fracture a community, breeding fear and suspicion. A shared threat, like a famine-inducing plague, can cause panic and social breakdown. The trial served as a powerful binding agent. It brought everyone together: the magistrate, the clergy, the farmers, the artisans, for a single, collective purpose. They gathered in the courthouse and the town square not just as individuals, but as a unified body, a congregation of the faithful and a citizenry of the realm. In the trial, they publicly reaffirmed their shared beliefs, their faith in God's justice, their respect for the law's authority, and their collective identity as a community that would not tolerate such transgressions. The public execution was the final, grim act of solidarity. By bearing witness together, they collectively purged the crime and moved forward with a renewed sense of shared purpose and security. A small, telling detail is that in the records of the ecclesiastical trials, the lawsuit is often brought by the community of the parish of X. It wasn't one farmer suing the weevils, it was the entire community acting as a single legal entity. The trial was a formal expression of their unity in the face of a common enemy. Historians debating the ultimate purpose of the trials often circle these three themes. Was it primarily about justice, order, or social cohesion? The truth is, you cannot separate them. They were three strands of the same rope. The act of performing justice created order, and the public performance of creating order solidified the community. It was a self-reinforcing loop. The animal trials weren't just a weird legal footnote, they were a vital piece of social technology that, for a time, helped medieval communities navigate a dangerous and uncertain world. They were a strange and beautiful, if brutal, solution to the timeless human problem of how to live together in the face of fear. And so, here we are. We've traveled from a French courthouse in 1457 all the way to the fading echoes of the 19th century. We've seen pigs and weevils, dogs and dolphins, all standing before the majesty of the law. But there is one final character in this story we haven't properly met yet. They are the silent, diligent figures who made our entire journey tonight possible, the humble court clerks. Every fact we know, every absurd detail, every name and date comes to us because some man, hundreds of years ago, sat at a wooden desk with a quill in his hand and dutifully wrote it all down. Imagine him for a moment. He's not a lord or a bishop. He's a functionary, a professional record keeper. His job is to listen and to write. He dips his pen into a pot of ink made from oak galls and dian salts, and on a sheet of expensive, stiff parchment made from the scraped and treated skin of a calf or a sheep he records the proceedings. This is the mainstream historical point that underpins everything, the bureaucracy of it all. These records were not private diaries, they were official government and church documents. The decision to commit a trial to parchment was a significant one. These materials were costly, and the clerk's time was valuable. The fact that they chose to meticulously document the trial of a pig, logging the cost of its food in jail and the fee for the hangman's rope, tells you more than anything else just how serious this was to them. This was not a joke. This was official business, worthy of being recorded for posterity. You can almost feel the texture of it. If you were in an archive today, a librarian might bring you one of these dossiers. You'd see the heavy, brownish parchment, the elegant but faded calligraphy, the formal Latin or Old French, and you would read a sentence that makes your modern brain short-circuit. Item: for a new pair of gloves for the pig to wear to the gallows, 2 pence. And here we find a wonderfully human and quirky detail hidden in the archives. Sometimes, in the margins of these solemn medieval manuscripts, clerks would doodle. They'd draw a funny face, a knight fighting a snail, or make a personal note about being cold or bored. While we don't have a confirmed doodle of a pig in a waistcoat, it's these little human touches that remind us the people writing these records were not faceless drones. They were real people, which leads to a final, unanswerable question that historians still love to debate. What was that clerk thinking when he wrote down the charge against the rooster of Basel for laying an egg? Was he doing it with a straight face, fully believing in the demonic implications, or was he a weary cynic, rolling his eyes at the superstitions of his bosses, but doing his job because he needed to get paid? Was he a true believer, a professional technician of the law, or a quiet satirist? We will never know. His inner thoughts are lost to time, and we are left with only his neat, careful script. In the end, the journey of this story is a relay race through time. It begins with the event itself, the crime. Then the clerk records it, handing the baton to the parchment. For centuries, the parchment sits in a dusty archive, until a historian in the 19th or 20th century finds it and writes a book, handing the baton to the modern age. And tonight, that baton has been passed once more from the book, through a microphone, across the quiet darkness of the internet, and into your ears, transforming from a legal document into a murmur in the dark, a story to help you drift away from a courtroom drama to a final, sleepy thought. Then now, the journey is over. The courtroom has grown quiet, its stone walls holding only the echoes of old arguments. The flickering torchlight has dwindled down to the soft glow of a single, final ember. The meticulous clerk has put the stopper in his inkwell, brushed the strays and from his parchment, and gone home. The weary lawyer, Bartholomew Chasney has finally rested his case, and the silence that follows is deep and profound. All those strange entangled tales of the pig in its waistcoat, the rats who feared the cats, the rooster who committed an unnatural crime are now just whispers, fading back into the deep, quiet archives of the past. They are no longer facts to be analyzed, but fragments of a dream you were already having. Feel the weight of your blanket, a gentle anchor in the soft darkness. Listen to the steady, rhythmic hum of the fan, a sound that washes away all the noise of the day. The story is done, the voices are faded. There is nothing left to do now but drift. Let the last thoughts dissolve. Let the darkness be a soft cushion, and let the gentle tide of sleep pull you out into a calm and peaceful sea. The end of the article. Good night.